Your answers. It's my pleasure to introduce Alice Cottingham, who is, among other things, the project manager for the Illinois Funders Census Initiative, and she'll be moderating the next panel and talking about the work that community-based organizations are doing to increase the mail-in rate. So, with no further ado, I turn it over to Alice.
Great, thank you. I'm not on, am I? Okay, there I go. Thank you, Scott. I'm really pleased to be here too, and I'm very, very pleased and honored to be here with colleagues who are some of the smartest people out in the field this year doing education, outreach, and mobilization of a whole range of kinds of residents in Chicago to mobilize them to complete their census forms and mail them back. Because that's, as you heard recently, is the phase of the census operations that's the relatively inexpensive phase. And that's also the phase when the most accurate information is gathered. So that's the emphasis of our initiative, which I'll tell you about in just a second. But let me tell you how this panel is going to work. I'm going to talk with you briefly to tell you about the Illinois Census Funders Initiative. Then I'm going to turn it over to Flavia Jimenez and Monica Starzuk, who with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, who will talk with you about the census work they're doing in immigrant communities in Chicago and a couple of suburbs this year. And then you will hear from Josina Morita, who is with United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations. I always call it United Congress. When I have to do the whole name, I always sort of mix up the words. Sorry, Josina. Do you? Good, okay. And she will tell you about the work that United Congress is doing in a half a dozen communities here in Chicago. As you will hear, these are two organizations that are doing very smart, very targeted, very effective work. And I think that we are all going to benefit from their work. And I look forward to your hearing more about how they're doing their work. To tell you briefly about the Illinois Funders Census Initiative, this is a funders collaborative of 10 foundations. And they're listed here. I hope you can see those a little bit. And I think you've got a handout too. And I won't run through them. I'll tell you that in November of 2008, a couple of people at the Joyce Foundation, Gretchen Crosby Sims and Lawrence Hansen, started talking about what foundations could do to try to assure a more accurate count in 2010. And by the spring of 2009, they had talked another 9 foundations into being part of this initiative. And together, the foundations committed $1.29 million for this. And of that, 1.22 million of it has been used for grants to community organizations around the state of Illinois, primarily in Chicago, but elsewhere as well. And just to note that the contributions from the foundations ranged quite a lot. The foundation that put in the least amount of money contributed $2,500, and the foundation that put in the most put in $350,000, so quite a range. I don't know if you know, but in Chicago, philanthropy is unusually inclined to collaborative ventures. I've worked with funders around the country, and no city collaborates the way Chicago does. And so this is only one of a long series of collaborations, and it definitely is, I think, one of the more collegial and the clearest one, because the focus is so clear. Let me also tell you a little bit about the strategy. As we looked at proposals, we put out an RFP in early 2009 and asked community groups to propose work that they would do to try to increase people's return of their census forms. And our strategy as funders was to look at, of the applications we got, which had the absolute smartest plans, which were organizations that had very clear capacity to do the work they were proposing to do, and which were the groups that had significant networks through which they could do their work. Because our premise was it's community-based organizations who have relationships to people in communities, and they have a whole variety of networks and channels through which they work. They start out with strong credibility with those communities, and they are really effective messengers to do this work. We were surprised to receive 79 proposals for funding, and we were even more surprised to find that at least 60 of those could have been funded. They proposed very smart, very effective seeming work. We had to narrow it down. We only funded 26 groups, and it's a painful thing to go from looking at 60 that you'd like to fund to 26 that you can. We focused the work on high-priority communities, those community areas in Chicago that had relatively low male response rates in the year 2000. That is, where the percentage of residents or households who returned their forms in the year 2000 was less than 60%. And in Chicago, and outside Chicago, we looked for towns and cities where the male response rate was also lower than other places in the state. And if I remember correctly, all of those have response rates of less than 65%. And ideally, what we looked to do was to fund in areas where there were 3 or more of these very strong organizations proposing to do work. Because our theory was, if you flood the zone, as it were, and you fund a variety of organizations to work cooperatively with one another in the same areas at high intensity, presumably you result in a community where there's a very high degree of consciousness about the census and a high level of commitment to responding to it. We ultimately funded 21 groups in Chicago, or groups doing work in Chicago and somewhere outside Chicago, 5 organizations who are working outside of the city, and we are providing a platform for grantees to meet 3 times over the course of the funding period, and ultimately we will do a final evaluation and documentation of this work, because one of the things that was frustrating, I think, for everybody working on this is there had been some community-based work that was done in 2000, but the institutional memory about what worked and what didn't and how and which strategies and tactics were powerful was effectively lost. And this time the funders are determined to capture what worked and what didn't, so that if they come back to this in 10 years, and I think it likely they will start not from ground zero next time. And that will apply, of course, to community organizations as well. I'm going to show you a couple maps that look great. All right. Well, they look better than I thought they were going to. I saw them on the computer, and it looked like they were going to be very squashed, and you wouldn't recognize what state this was. But this is just a visual for where we are funding census work outside of Chicago. And then I also can show you this visual, which is a map of Chicago divided up by the city's official community areas. And the dark areas are places where we are funding work. And then down the side is a list of all of those specific community areas. Of the 26 organizations we funded, the 2 organizations that we made the largest grants to are the 2 organizations who are represented on this table today. They are both network or coalition organizations, and for that reason, we really see them as extremely critical players in our effort that we're supporting. We also, though, are funding some organizations that are very grassroots and local and work, in many instances, just in one community area. Claretian Associates in South Chicago and Teamwork Englewood in the Englewood community are 2 examples of that. So there's a range of kinds of organizations. I also want to call out a couple of other grantees who I know are in the audience today who are also doing extraordinary work. One of them is Age Options, which is working in, I think, 8 different communities around the state of Illinois, working specifically with older residents in the state who are also at risk of not responding accurately and completely to the census. And also I want to recognize Illinois Action for Children, which is doing work through child care centers to try to encourage families with children in them to respond, because children are actually the population group that is the least well counted in the census. Okay, let me turn this over to Flavia and Monica, and you can hear from them about their work.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I want to not show you that. I want to show you something else. We have a very, 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 very important goal for this particular census count. The Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, just so you know, it's going to be hard to read your slides because I realized when I did this, it looked very nice on the screen, and then I realized that when you printed it, you can't really read the words. It's okay. You can hear me, and then we can talk about it later, and then you'll remember everything. Just to let you know, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights is an organization that has been around for about 25 years. And we have over 100 members that are immigrant-serving organizations. We have all of these organizations that have a very, very important goal of serving the immigrant community. It's a diverse group, I would say, the most diverse immigrant coalition in the country. But we don't just think about serving the community. We think about organizing the community. And organizing and advocacy is one of our primary goals. Now, I was downstairs, and I saw that you all were going to, the SSA school was going to invite the Gamaliel organization to talk about Barack Obama and him being an organizer. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because they have the same picture that we have up in our office, which is when Barack Obama was a law professor at the University of Chicago. There's a picture of him on a blackboard, and he's talking about self-interest. And what is this self-interest piece, and why do we talk about it? Well, organizers talk about self-interest because that is how you get community and communities to engage in their own empowerment in order to change their own dynamic, right? So, and I want to start off by saying this because this is why we are doing the census work. We're not just doing the census work because we want immigrants to fill out pieces of paper. It's very nice to fill out this piece of paper and then send it back to the U.S. Census Bureau. We all know the benefits of that, so I'm not going to get into it. But what does it mean? Really, why do we do this? This is just one piece of an overall pie, the bigger puzzle of empowering the immigrant community in the state of Illinois, and to play a role, not just here in Illinois, but at the national level. We are recognized as a national leader on comprehensive immigration reform and immigrant integration. So how do you have people in the state of Illinois? Approximately 500,000 people are currently undocumented in the state. Another 500,000 approximately are legal permanent residents that are able to access citizenship. But there are significant barriers to accessing U.S. citizenship for those legal, lawful permanent residents. And then, once those folks become citizens, how do you engage them in voting? The full range of civic participation, of course, includes, every 10 years, filling out your census form, right? Because this is just as much a civil rights issue for us as it is anything else. As you probably know, in 1790, right, when this first got started, the African slave in the United States was counted as 60% of a person. And Native Americans were not counted as people at all in the U.S. Census. So what does that mean for the undocumented immigrant who doesn't count in terms of society and how we recognize that person? Of course, they count in terms of the census because everyone is counted, but for other purposes in our society, that person does not count. It's a challenge for us, right, to try to get the approximately 500,000 people who are currently undocumented to say, oh, you know, that's okay. I might have gotten last month an order of deportation from the U.S. government or a notice to appear at an immigration court for me to be split up from my family, but of course I will fill out this piece of paper stating my name and how many people currently live here. Right? It's a big challenge. And I think that this is something that we should not talk about, we should really consider. Let me talk about the overall work of ICIRR. So with this funding collaborative, as Alice mentioned, we will reach people in the immigrants in the Spanish, Urdu, Chinese, Arabic, Korean, Polish, and Hindi. In all those languages, we will have information for individuals in the state. 14 of our New Americans, we have a New Americans Initiative project which helps people become citizens, but we've taken this model and we are developing, we went in even further with 14 of these organizations that have hired what we call Census Fellows. And the fellows have been trained in community organizing and are going to be using this training in order to develop a base and build relationships in communities so that members of those communities understand that the importance of the census. I'm going to let Monica in a bit get into, for a couple minutes, get into some of the goals and some of the challenges that we're facing in these communities.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I work at ICR, Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, as a field coordinator for New Americans Initiative. That's our citizenship program. But foremost, I'm a community organizer. And I've been involved in voter registration drives for the past 5 years in Polish, Arab, and South Asian communities throughout the city and suburbs. And at ICR, for the past 8 years, we've been running Get Out the Vote efforts. It's an extremely successful campaign. We are registering thousands upon thousands of voters throughout the state. And we decided last year when we were drafting the census campaign draft to use exactly the same model to run the census project. So we are really playing by the book. From our perspective, face-to-face interactions are the most successful. So as Flavia mentioned, we hired 14 fellows. They are placed in Chicago and suburbs, all the way through Waukegan, through Aurora, Cicero, north side, south side of the city. Each fellow has about a 5,000 household universe. So, and those universes are based on the census hot track maps. So those are the areas that more than 50% of people did not fill out their forms last year. And in a nutshell, it's a door knocking campaign. Our census fellows started door knock on January 10th, and they door knock every single day since January 10th, and they will be doing this until April 1st. Again, we are using Get Out the Vote efforts, so it's very intense. Every household will be contacted up to 4 times. So it's not just one door knock. They will get door knocked twice. They will get a phone call, and they will get a literature dropped at their doorsteps. So again, extremely intense, and we already have been hearing from some of the folks who are being door knocked the second time, oh, you're extremely disorganized. You already came and talked to me. So the message definitely is working out. But we are a live project, even though we came with the sense of plan we had, but then, once our fellows hit the streets, and we're using data from a year of 2000. Turns out that the hot tracks and the populations are changed significantly. As, for example, you see up here on the screen, it's a map of Pilsen area. And the purple areas, in 2000, they're heavily immigrant areas. Our fellows this year told us that those areas to your right, those 2 blocks are extremely gentrified right now. So there's a lot of professionals who moved into that area. And to your left, there's a lot of African Americans who moved in. So we adjusted. And we had quite a few communities that after 2 weeks on the ground, our fellows said, we need to adjust. We need to make sure that we are reaching to immigrant communities. And today, our fellows have a day off because Friday is the least successful day in terms of door knocking. But last night, we had a conference call. We have those conference calls 3 times a week. And as of yesterday night, we door knocked over 65,000 doors. And we collected over 10,000 pledge cards from our residents. So it's definitely very intense. And let me just tell you why are we going to be successful with this campaign. Because it's not the questions if, because we are going to be successful. Because of our fellows. They are extremely diverse. They are leaders in the communities. They speak at least 2 languages, and they have a passion for this work. They are community organizers. They are not doing this work because of the pay of the hours. They are passionate about this. The second component is volunteer involvement. Every fellow has between 10 to 20 volunteers. So on every given day, we have between 140 to 280 people on the streets door knocking throughout the city and suburbs. We have young people who are extremely passionate about this work, who are going out and door knocking. You know, it's been snowing for the past 3 days. They're out there and door knocking. The third component, we are a coordinated campaign. It's very intense. We have daily reports, 3 times a week, conference calls and meetings just to make sure that we are keeping each other in check. Flavia mentioned the self-interest. This is absolutely the most important component of this campaign. You know, when we talk to a mother with kids, we talk about education. When we talk to a young fellow, we talk about who has a probably fancy car. We talk about roads. That's what appeals to them. And the last component is we unite the community. As Flavia mentioned, you know, for most of our campaigns, we target specific groups. This time around, everyone are our targets. And our organizations that are established and trusted in the community, and we message around the issues. We message the census messaging around the issues that are important to them. So again, it's 33 days and counting, and we are still out there. Thank you.
So I'm just going to take a couple more minutes, just 30 seconds, sorry, to talk about messaging and messages, because this is really important to us, particularly when we talk about the undocumented community. So ethnic media, we've partnered with a lot of ethnic media sources, and this is an immensely useful tool for us. That immigrants greatly distrust any information that doesn't come from a person who they know or they have seen before. And so by working with ethnic media, they read it in Oi newspaper, other newspapers in their own language. It's very helpful. Messages. So we talk about certain messages that work. It will benefit your community. It's confidential. This is extremely important for the undocumented community. The municipality issue, this does not go to your local government, so doubling up of families, you know, more members of a household than should be there is really important. It only takes a minute and have a great impact, and you can go to your local community organization and ask them questions about it. And of course, our local organizations are going to be a tremendous help for us in finishing this project off. The one thing that we also want to touch upon, of course, is redistricting. We do a lot of political work. We do a lot of voter work. And so how the map is redrawn for us is extremely important in the future of ICIRR and the continuing of the building of the political power in the immigrant community. So thank you so much. We're going to play a 1-minute clip for you of something that a student journalist pulled together so that you can have a sense of what a fellow goes through every day.
Thanks. So, wow, that's impressive. I want to preface my presentation by saying we're about 1/20th of the size of ICIRR. So I think that they're doing great work, and ours is on a much smaller scale than theirs. I work with a group called the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations. We are a grassroots human rights alliance that includes 9 member organizations, all grassroots community organizing groups based in communities of color in Chicago, who all have executive directors and leadership of color. We were founded about 5 years ago to come together to think about how we can build better relationships, connect our issues, and try to work together on a shared policy agenda across different racial and religious communities in Chicago. Being one of the most segregated cities in Chicago, and organizing is no different. If you know about the organizing culture in Chicago, that's a very big challenge. And so that's a big part of our mission. So we talk about how we can bring different racial and religious communities together. We use a framework around human rights and racial equity. And I think the census fit perfectly into that. I think the census is a human rights and racial equity. Oh, sorry. Is it this one? Yeah, there we go. That's a picture of all of us. is a human rights and racial equity issue. I think even like Flavia said, the history in communities of color it comes up in every single meeting that we have, the history of African Americans being counted as 3/5 of a human being. The fact that currently still on the House floor, the term illegal alien is used. So just the idea, and I think we don't always think about it this way, but the census is very progressive. The idea that everybody counts, and that's something that we definitely wanted to promote. And it's really important to our organization as a whole. We talk about mobilizing people, policy, and ideals, and the idea that everyone counts, that we're really looking at all people. This affects our ability to move policy. Flavia mentioned redistricting, especially as a multiracial coalition. Our understanding is that it's quite likely with redistricting this year that the state will lose an African American district and gain 2 Latino districts. Our understanding is that the loss of the African American district is due a lot to the dispersion of the African American community, not necessarily to population loss and then the Latino districts because of population gain. But of course, the way that this can be framed could be very divisive, and as a multiracial coalition, it's been really important for us to be on the front end of this, both in terms of ensuring as complete a count as we can in African American communities to try and protect that district, as well as to educate and inform and engage people around this whole process, not just the end product of redistricting. And then ideals, again, the idea that everyone counts, the idea that everyone should participate in this broader process has been very important as a human rights and racial equity issue. Let's see. Okay. So we have 9 member organizations. 6 are participating in this particular census initiative, while a number of others are also doing census work in other capacities, including we're here at SSA. One of our member organizations, MAGIC, Metropolitan Area Groups for Igniting Civilization, was founded here at SSA. We have a number of staff who are graduates of SSA, so I want to recognize that broader kind of context. So we are working in 6 different community areas in Chicago: Auburn Gresham, Chicago Lawn, Inglewood, Kenwood, Oakland, and Westtown. These communities had 2000 mail-back response rates ranging from 39 to 56%, so very, very low. We have a lofty goal. You can see our different numbers of the 10% increase rate and the 20%. We have a lofty goal of trying to increase the mail-back response rate within each of these communities by 20%. And our strategy is to really focus on the hardest to count populations within these communities. So we work in predominantly Black and Latino low-income communities, and our target populations are particularly Black men and ex-offenders. The prison population and the proportion of people with past criminal convictions has grown tremendously, especially in the areas like Auburn, Gresham, and Inglewood. Female-headed households, I think Alice talked about the impact in terms of trying to count younger children. Displaced residents, and we look at this in 3 different ways, particularly in the context of the communities that I mentioned. So public housing demolition has displaced a large number of families, particularly in the Kenwood and Oakland areas. Gentrification, also in Kenwood and Oakland, as well as Westtown, has pushed a lot of residents out of communities. They're both doubling up as well as moving to different neighborhoods. And foreclosures, particularly in Chicago Lawn, has been one of the hardest hit zip codes when it comes to foreclosures. So the challenge that a number of our door knockers have faced is they go to doors and nobody lives there. And where did those families go? And a lot of them have stayed within the community as well as gone elsewhere. So looking at the different dynamics of how populations and families have moved, not only in the last 10 years, but even the last 10 weeks. In a number of our different communities. And lastly, immigrants and undocumented immigrants, and particularly in the Westtown area, looking at those are the particular hard-to-count populations that our strategies have been focused on. And we do this in a number of ways. A lot of these populations are groups that we work with already through our organizing campaigns. So we have a number of ex-offender transitional programs. We worked on policy around reentry programs. So we have direct access to a lot of these populations. They're our leaders. They are our street team, so they're doing direct peer-to-peer outreach. We've been working with churches and schools as well. and a lot of our social service programs and housing counseling programs and things like that. So looking at where people are already at and trying to utilize those resources and opportunities. I think that the main strategy has been to link, for these populations, linking the census to issues that are already most important to them. Right, so I think in the previous panel, somebody mentioned the issue around how prisoners are counted in the census. That's been a really big issue for our community. We're supporting, there's a House Bill 4650. We understand the challenges within the Census Bureau to change their data collection practices, but states can authorize the reallocation of prisoners from the prisons to their home districts with their own data. So we're advocating that Illinois do this for the next process of redistricting. This has been a big issue. We're taking 200 people down to Springfield next Tuesday to advocate on 4650. That's a bill sponsored by Ford. Connecting it, of course, in this current economic climate, the broad overarching issue of resources and economic development for these different communities. So we've held about 10 different focus groups with the target populations and tried to develop messages. And it's actually interesting because it's very different than a lot of the national groups that have done testing with African American populations and immigrant populations. A lot of them have used stuff like Obama won, and so you count, and MLK had a dream, and you count. And honestly, it's been a little bit of a stretch with some of our communities that have a lot of day-to-day issues that they face. And the things that have been most effective, and this kind of goes to the gentleman's question earlier today, the messages that have worked best. So roughly $400 billion a year in federal funds, $14 billion to Illinois are allocated based on census information. So this has huge implications for what money comes in and where it goes within our communities. That census information is used to decide where schools will be built and where services will be provided. A lot of our communities are facing school closings, things like that. And so this issue relates directly to the issues that they're facing day to day and that they're organizing around. And then it's interesting, we talk about that 12,000 figure over 10 years per person that money will come in. And the message that resonated most is actually not that $12,000 would come in, but that if you don't fill out your census form, $12,000 will not come in. When you talk to community residents, they feel, their communities have been so underfunded. There's such a lack of resources and infrastructure. They see more what doesn't exist than necessarily what does. And so that reframing of, it's 12,000 that could be lost versus 12,000 that could be gained has resonated most with our folks. Our strategy, we did those focus groups to better understand people's experiences and perceptions around the census. 90% of the people we talk to don't know if they've ever filled out a census form. They just don't know. They don't remember. It's not memorable. It's not something that's resonated with them. It happens every 10 years. So that's a challenge. We recruited and trained what we're calling census ambassadors. So we have a few hundred census folks who've been, community leaders who've been trained around the census, who are doing their own presentations and peer-to-peer outreach around the census. We have what we're calling institutional partners. So we've been working with businesses. We actually have grocery bags that we give to them that have census information on them that they can use for those small grocery stores and things like that. We've been doing census Sundays at the churches, so working with pastors who remind folks every Sunday. They're going to have assistance forms at churches on those Sundays when the forms are there. We're doing broader assistance forms in large tenant buildings and working with housing tenant councils and things like that. And we have our street team members that are going to be doing that door-to-door outreach, especially during the last 2 weeks, because the forms are supposed to hit households around the 10th. And then we have that kind of very short window to try and get everyone to actually fill out their forms. So that's a big part of our ground strategy. So you can kind of see the numbers by community. We've been collecting commitment cards through our outreach. So one strategy that we've been told that works well, and it seems to have worked well, is we have people, we educate them about the census. They sign something that says that they're going to fill out the census, and we actually fold it so that you can't see the signature and mail it back to them. So they not only get census information, but they are reminded that they made that commitment themselves. They see their own signature when they get it back in the mail, and the timing is meant for them to get it around the same time that they get their form. We are doing phone banking and door knocking, like Monica said, and so that's been a big part of our strategy. And the census is not our end game. We talk about redistricting and a lot of the policy initiatives that come out of this. As community organizers, I think it's been really, we spend years mobilizing thousands of leaders to try and fight for one program that costs $50,000, right? This is an interesting way to look at it as an organizing campaign where if takes 10 minutes to bring in $12,000 per person over 10 years, so you think about all the time and energy and work that we put into fighting for these different programs. This is a way to do it in, a very effective way that has much broader meaning and broader implications for our communities. So it's been very important for us.
Thank you. So you've heard about two organizations' very smart, very thoughtful approaches to how to prepare residents to recognize the form when it comes in the mail, complete it, and send it back. And a number of the grantees in the Count Me In initiative, which is what the funders initiative calls the grants program, are using quite similar tactics. And many of them are also going to be established as Be Counted centers and questionnaire assistance centers by the Census Bureau, so that they will be available in communities to help residents who need support in filling out their questionnaires to get that help. And my hunch is that a lot of them are going to end up filling the gap around the mailbox problem in communities. I also just want to say, whenever you call out groups, you always forget somebody, and I did. And I want to also acknowledge that the Center for Economic Progress is also here, and they are another grantee of the Count Me In initiative, and they are doing work through tax assistance centers all over the state. And Chicago Commons, Enrique Sagado is also here, and Chicago Commons is doing work in Humboldt Park and several other communities. They are a real model of a community-based organization that's doing work collaboratively with several other organizations in their community. And then I should also just note that the Chicago Community Trust, which is one of the original partners of the Funders Census Initiative, also serves as its fiscal administrator. And Juanita Izaguirre is here today, and she will be staying, I think, all day. I won't. So if you have questions after this presentation, seek her out. Would you raise your hand, Juanita? Great, thank you. So see her. I want to ask one question, then I want to open it up to all of you. And the question I want to ask the panel is, so what are residents saying? Are they going to fill out the form?
From our perspective, yes, they will. As I said, we door knocked 65,000 doors and collected 10,000 pledge cards. And those are the only folks who said they will fill out the pledge cards. And we talked to many, many more. And as I said, we messaging around issues that are important to them. And when they understand it's not just a law, it's because the money is coming back. If you have kids in overcrowded schools, this is the way to bring a new school to the community. If you keep getting flat tires when you're driving, it's because the roads are in this kind of conditions. We're going to get better roads. It's definitely responding with them.
Great.
I think the challenge is that people are pretty unengaged around the issue, and I think in some ways we've flipped that script some in some of our communities. So, like for instance, in Oakland, according to the 2000 census, there are 2,000 people living in Oakland. I think anybody who knows Oakland knows that there's way more than 2,000 people living in Oakland. So we kind of use the outrage. So we say, for the last 10 years, because people didn't fill out their census forms, for the last 10 years, we've been getting the resources and the representation for 2,000 people. Are we going to let this happen again? So sometimes flipping that. But I think in general, like Monica said, our messages have been relatively effective around money and representation and connecting it to local issues that are most important to people. So we're hoping we have about 17,000 commitment cards, and we hope that means way more responses.
Great. Questions that you all have? Or comments on what you've heard? Yes, Jennifer.
How long is this effort lasting? Is it until the end of April?
The grants run through the end of April, and groups will tail off their work at different times. But as I think you've heard here, for the groups who are doing this work, This work, my hunch is that the money ends and the work continues, because people will need to continue to be encouraged to fill out their forms. Now, the enumeration phase, in which people who haven't returned forms then are visited by census workers, begins in mid-April. So at some point, people will need to pull out as that enumeration begins. But clearly there's going to be a parallel effort. And I guess I just really want to underline what these grantees are doing is not the same thing as what census workers are doing. They have personal relationships and relationships that they're crafting in their communities and their constituencies, and they're educating people and trying to motivate people. And they really see them, we see this initiative as a partnership with the Census Bureau. So one of many that they have.
And
yes.
I just had a thing. So a lot of immigrant communities are very mobile. So we
Right.
have some of the communities, especially up in the north side and uptown, that someone rents an apartment for 2-3 months. So if we talk to someone in January, most likely by the time the form will arrive, they will maybe not be there anymore. So definitely from our end, this education component to making sure that no matter where you're gonna be, April 1st, make sure you fill out the form or seek a place, questionnaire assistance center where you can get one.
Yes.
I understand the motivation of talking about economic impact, but I also wonder, are we overselling that to our communities? That it's because the underlying basis is kind of a win-lose, because I don't think the net amount of federal money doesn't increase because of the census, and that even if more monies are, your community is eligible for more monies, that governments don't always send dollars to the communities that need them most. So I think that are we sort of setting ourselves up, our communities up, for more disengagement and more disenfranchisement? Well, we did all this, and we're documented as a high-need community now, and guess what? We still didn't. And you could do all the right things, and you could still not get the resources. So I think tying census to some of these things that are beyond the control of the census, and having some engagement around those.
Oh, you want to? Okay. Well, we've been very intentional. We talk about this in trainings about not overselling. We've been told that the 12,000 figure is actually very conservative. I think some of our leaders have been inclined to talk about exactly what that could buy, and that'll come. And we really have cautioned people not to do that, to not oversell, because I think the census in many ways sells itself in terms of the broader significance as well as the money. But I think that to your point, the whole point I think of why Alice really emphasized funding community organizing groups and why we do the work that we do is this is not just about the census. Right, that this is linked to broader organizing, and this is an opportunity to engage people around broader social justice issues and improving their local communities. That would, of course, go beyond the census. So we see this as a leadership development opportunity, a civic engagement opportunity, and an opportunity to reach a broader base than we necessarily would through our traditional organizing campaigns.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, so you're talking to an individual at the door about the importance of the census, and you're also engaging that individual in the broader community organizing effort, so that you're coming back to them perhaps over the summer and you're saying to them, are you registered to vote? Register to vote. Get out to vote. I invite you to this candidates forum, right? And what you're doing is you're building that political power so that, yes, maybe, filling out the census form doesn't mean then that the following year you got a brand new school in your right, but of course you have to fight for those resources and continue to engage that member of the community in the broader, whether it's schools or health clinics or language access in the case of an immigrant community. So it's part of the bigger picture, I think, as well.
I'm sorry, I have but again, I'm going to bring up a local example. One of the fellows that is working this campaign is placed in Chinatown. They don't have a high school. So for them, this is actually about bringing a high school, because 10 years ago, not everyone were counted. Right now, they have a lot of kids in the high school age that are being bused 5 miles, 7 miles away from their households. And to bring enough money to build a house, the high school, we need about 6,500 people to fill out the census forms. So this is the actual number.
Yes.
Can you talk about the messaging around truthfulness in reporting? Because while we are all concerned about the undercount, what about an overcount? What about people who say, just what you said, we got to get a high school here, I'm going to pad it.
Well,
So that we indeed get
yeah. The Census Bureau actually takes a lot of precautions to make sure that it doesn't overcount, and there is some overcounting, but it tends to be overcounts of people who own two homes, whose both homes get count. Both households end up the household ends up completing a form from both residences. It's not an overcount of people who are hard to count. I mean, we know who's historically undercounted. And census forms come geocoded. I mean, the ones you receive in your home have to your household come with a barcode on them that really specifies what your address is. And if you end up picking up a form at a Be Counted center instead, that won't have a barcode, so there's a confirmation process to assure that it's a legitimate address and that it's not a duplicate. Mr. Moore, would you add anything to that, if I got that right?
Yes, there's a field verification. On those questionnaires, there's a field verification. The ones that are not barcode, we go back out and check.
Right.
To eliminate duplicates. I did want to comment. I hesitated to do that. But I am getting a lot of calls from people creating fraud. And I think that the Census Bureau doesn't do any operation ahead of time. We run a test after a test, and then we do a dress rehearsal, and then we do the census. And what I heard up there kind of caused me some concern, because if you're asking questions of household, I don't want them to think that they already did their census. I also think you open the door for a lot of people to create fraud. So I would caution you not to ask people for their names, addresses, Social Security, and those kind of things, because we are getting a lot of that now.
We have provided training to all the grantees, and no one is asking for Social Security numbers or any other kind of identification information like that. I mean, there are a number of groups that are asking people to sign pledge cards, and in many instances, pledge cards are then being mailed back as reminders to people, but those have name and address information on them only.
And I just talked to Mr. Moore about this before the panel started, and because you all live in the local area, I thought I'd mention it, because we're still trying to figure out exactly what's happening. But our folks in Kenwood and Oakland have reported that people have been coming to their doors in census gear, asking them to fill out forms, even being threatening. And this actually happened to one of our staff members. And we're trying to figure out who these people are. So especially as people who live and work in this particular area, if this is something that we've been hearing about, if you have any information, and our concern is that because people don't want to be overcounted, that it's going to affect an even more dramatic undercount with confusion and fraud.
And I'm sorry, and also our census fellows work with the community organizations who've been part of their communities for years. Quite often, those organizations who've been working for 10, 20, 30 years. They're established. When fellows go on door knock with their volunteers, they have clear identification. They say their names. They state who are they associated with. So we definitely take any sort of precaution and also educate folks that this is, the census comes in the mail. If anyone door knocks and tells you we are a census people, fill out a form with us right now, it's not the case.
We have time probably for one more question or comment.
I have a question. A lot of your description of people who don't fill out the forms sort of deals with benign neglect, or they're too busy, they're distracted, they're not interested, they don't see the benefit of it, they don't see things coming to them or their community when they do this. But I'm wondering to what extent you also deal with genuine distrust and suspicion about what government does with the information. How much of that you're still battling as opposed to don't bother me with this?
I mean, I did touch on this issue of the undocumented because I think this particular group of folks is the biggest challenge in terms of the distrust and the raids and deportations that have occurred, particularly in the Latino community over the past 8 to 10 years, do have an impact on individuals trusting government. That is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to try to get people to mail back their forms, because it's very likely that if there's even one undocumented individual in the home, then the entire household will be told, if anyone comes knocking on your door, do not answer the door. As a matter of fact, we as immigrant rights organizations train people to not answer the door unless that person has the appropriate court order signed by a judge, because people in the middle of the night have been at gunpoint taken away from their families. So when you talk about fear and mistrust, and this is why we begged the Obama administration to end raids and deportations, at least while this very important issue of the census was taken care of. And it fell on deaf ears. And so, yes, it's a very, very important issue. But we have to do the best we can, particularly with the undocumented population, to say this is 100% confidential. You can fill out your form. You should not fear. It's simple. Here's a local community organization that is telling you this is safe. It's for your benefit and the benefit of your family. And that's really the biggest challenge right now.
And can I just mention something in response to that, which is you may not be aware of this, but it may be helpful to you, and you could certainly get a copy of it because it's public information. But the Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, wrote a letter to the Archbishop in Los Angeles addressing the question of raids during the census. And she said, I want to make it very clear, and this is in her letter, that our intent is not to go after people to deport them, that if we do any raids, we're really trying to prevent serious criminal activity that may be occurring during that period. So I don't know if that's helpful to you or not, but that is a statement from the Secretary of Homeland Security stating very clearly what her intent is during that period. So maybe that's helpful, maybe not, but I think you should at least be aware of it, and you can certainly have a copy of that letter, and it's written to Archbishop, so I think it holds a lot of weight.
Just add, I think the distrust issue is very real. One of our member groups is the Inner City Muslim Action Network in Chicago Lawn. They work with the Arab Muslim population, and it's very well known within that community that there was a real breach since the 2000 census in releasing census information. So, I mean, that's a very real issue, and we as community organizations have to be careful. We definitely support the census, but we can't promise anything that we don't have control over. So we say we think the census is important. It's supposed to be confidential. All of these things, we support it. We have a number of Muslim leaders, imams, that come out and support the census. But, I mean, that's a very real experience for many of the families in our communities.
And I would like to add, I think there are 3 components to why it's so hard to get immigrant communities counted. First of all is the language barrier. It's great that the Census Bureau is sending out 11 million forms in Spanish, but in Albany Park neighborhood up in the north side, there's 40 languages alone. It's just one neighborhood. And the second one is education level. Again, Census Bureau is great in providing materials and online, but again, not a lot of our folks do have access to internet and able to download and have those informations in their own languages. The third component is a lot of immigrants came after the year of 2000, so they have no recollection of the previous census. They have no idea what it is. And also in their own countries, they've never experienced census. So this is a new concept altogether for most of them. So I think this is why the work we do at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Refugees is so critical in terms of getting the immigrant votes counted. Immigrant population counted.
So I think this is a wonderful panel that highlights the real importance of the census, but also the outreach activities of community-based organizations, not just related to the census, but for other issues related to voice and access to opportunity. So join me in thanking this panel.